Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm coming to you with what I hope will be an interesting discussion of one of my favorite historical figures, Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. I talk a lot on this channel about Aethelflaed's famous father, Alfred the Great, and I think rightly so. He's a figure that I'm not only fascinated by and that I really love, but I also have a lot of respect for him. And I feel similarly with his daughter, Aethelflaed. I got to thinking about Aethelflaed recently because one of my favorite shows, The Last Kingdom, has recently released its newest season. And Aethelflaed took a really prominent role in it this season, and she also has a really prominent role in the books that it's based on by Bernard Cornwell, which I talk about on this channel all the time. I love those books. If you love historical fiction, pick up The Last Kingdom. I think you will really enjoy it. On the whole, I've been fairly pleased with the portrayal of her in the TV show and, I mean, really in the books. I think the books are incredibly well researched, but talking about the show, talking about the books, really that's a discussion for another day. But after watching season 4, I just really got to thinking about Aethelflaed. And I think in season 4 in particular, if you've seen it, that Aethelflaed is always portrayed as a little bit more capable than her brother Edward, who was the king in Wessex after Alfred died. And I think that's pretty true to the historical record. I think Edward in general is pretty much forgotten by history. And this goes for Aethelflaed too. And I think it's understandable because they are sandwiched between two of the most memorable kings of the Saxon period, Alfred the Great and Aethelstan. Aethelstan is really the first king of a united England. And so that's why his name lives on. And Alfred, of course, was just in general a genius. And the idea of a united England was his brainchild. So in some ways it makes sense, and I don't think that you can say that Aethelflaed is one who has been forgotten because she is a woman. I do think that that probably enters the discussion to a degree, but I think in general this is an overlooked period in history, the Anglo-Saxon period in general, and I think that she and Edward both suffer from being in this kind of liminal space between two greats. So that makes sense to me, and I think that the books and the show have gone a long way in garnering attention for them. So to tell you a little bit about Aethelflaed and really why I think she's memorable and why I think that we need to be discussing her more frequently, she is Alfred's eldest child. Her early life is murky in general, so her birth year is pretty disputed. I've read a single biography of Aethelflaed, and it was this, The Warrior Queen by Joanna Armin. I was really disappointed in this, and I think some of it was through no fault of its own. Especially in this earlier period of Aethelflaed's life, it had to do a lot of legwork to fill in the blanks. And unfortunately, even in her later life, there are entire just gaps of knowledge around Aethelflaed. And so what this book does is it takes Alfred's life and kind of supposes that Aethelflaed was there for the majority of what Alfred was doing, particularly during her childhood. And yeah, she was, but I think that there was certainly more research that could have been done, and I think there was more that could have been put into the book that we do know for sure, or at least speculate on, that Joanna Armin ignored, maybe because she couldn't know it for sure, and if that's the case, then I completely understand it. So at any rate, I have not been satisfied by a biography of Aethelflaed, and if you have a recommendation for one down below, I would love to hear it. And so in her young adulthood, Aethelflaed is married to the leader of Mercia, a man by the name of Aethelred. The Last Kingdom as a whole does him pretty dirty, but Bernard Cornwell, the author of the books, has been pretty straight up about the things that he's had to change. If you've watched the show or you've read the books, you know that Aethelflaed has a relationship with someone who is not Aethelred, and so I think he felt like he needed to villainize him in the narrative for that relationship to make sense. And I forgive him for that because he made a really interesting story. But likely the historical Aethelred was not nearly as bad as he is portrayed to be on the show or in the books. Now, his position is also fairly murky at this time. You will see that people in Mercia will kind of call him the king in Mercia, but you will see also people in Wessex refer to him as an ealdorman. And so essentially what that is he was really a nobleman of some import who would have been allowed a place in their political discussions in Wessex, and indeed he was. In the 890s, which is the decade after Aethelflaed married Ethelred, and yes, The names are all very similar. Welcome to the Anglo-Saxon period. But in the 890s, there was a series of Viking attacks that saw Aethelred and Edward kind of try to stave those off as they were making their names. Conflict with the Vikings really characterized the reigns of Alfred and Edward, and if you consider it a reign, which I do, Aethelflaed's reign. The 800s ended with Alfred's death in 899 and Edward's succession to the Wessex throne. Also around this time, Ethelred's health starts to decline. I don't know that that's ever been formally diagnosed or has ever been said for sure what he had. In fact, some scholars argue that he wasn't sick at all up until around the time that he died, but others say he was just in a prolonged illness for the last decade of his life. It seems to me, if I were to take a side on it, that he really was sick, because in the late 800s, early 900s is when it appears that Aethelflaed starts to come into the forefront and become the de facto ruler of Mercia. Interestingly, there are a couple of charters that survived with Ethelred and Aethelflaed's name on them. So this charter dates from 901, and it was originally written in Latin, but it says, Ethelred and Aethelflaed, rulers of Mercia, to the community of the Church of Much Wenlock, grant of 10 hides at Stanton Long and 3 hides at Coughley in Barrow, in exchange for 3 hides at Easthope and 5 at Patton. They also grant a gold chalice weighing 30 mancuses in honor of Abbess Mildberg. The photo that I just showed you is a facsimile, so this is not the original, but it's pretty interesting anyway, and it's still held by Much Wenlock. Another charter dates from 903, and it says, King Edward with Ethelred and Aethelflaed of Mercia, at the request of Ethelfrith Dux, renews the charter of a grant by Ethel to Ethelgith, his daughter, of 30 hides at Monk's Risborough, Bucks. So it's not a situation where you can say, she didn't survive in the historical record. Unfortunately, there's not a great deal of her in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I've also talked about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle ad nauseum. At this point, it probably deserves a video of its own. And I love the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a source. It is incredibly valuable, but it is focused almost entirely on Wessex. The most used version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle comes from Wessex at this time. And so as you might can imagine, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a little bit more focused on her brother, Edward, who was the king in Wessex, and so her name really doesn't show up there at all. During the first decade of the 900s, Aethelflaed makes the decision to fortify the old Roman town of Chester. This proves to be fairly fortuitous, because it was around this time that the Irish annals and a certain segment of them called the Three Fragments make note of the fact that the Norse in Dublin were expelled at that time. They negotiated with Aethelflaed, and she allowed them to settle in an area called the Wirral, and she was rightly skeptical of them from the get-go, and so that's kind of what fueled her decision to fortify Chester, and it was a good thing that she did, because it certainly came in handy. Ethelred died in 911. Some say from this prolonged illness, others say from injuries sustained at the Battle of Tettenhall, which is how it was portrayed on The Last Kingdom. Ethelred was sometimes called the Lord of the Mercians, and so that's the title that Aethelflaed was given upon his death, Lady of the Mercians. It's hard for me to stress how special this was. This was completely unprecedented. In Wessex, which was her homeland, women held no political power at all. And in fact, the wives of kings were denied the title of queen. In Mercia, there was some precedence for female rulers, but it was not on this scale. The Last Kingdom portrays Aethelflaed as a warrior who rode into battle beside her men and fought alongside them, and indeed she did lead armies. It's debated whether she would have fought. You will see some scholars explain that away by saying no leader, male or female, would have fought in the shield wall, and that was unlikely at this time, but you will see others who say leaders definitely fought. She was just more of a figurehead at the head of their army. It's still something that's debated. I think most people will say that she didn't fight. I think it would be nice to think that she did, but I don't know that I believe that. One of the most famous instances of her career came from very late in her life, in the year 917, and she decided to kind of make a foray into the 5 boroughs, which were Danish-held territory. And she succeeded in taking Derby, which was one of the 5 boroughs. And most people say she was likely at the head of this army herself. Within the year, another of the 5 boroughs, Leicester, fell to her without a fight. And in the months leading up to her death, it is said that the men of York pledged to her, which is really spectacular. But unfortunately, she was never able to make good on that offer because she did pass away in 918. Funnily enough, most scholars think that the people of York did not extend the same offer to Edward, the king in Wessex, which I think just goes to show how special Aethelflaed was. She died in a town that she fortified called Tamworth on June 12th, 918. She was eventually laid to rest at St. Oswald's Priory in Gloucester, which is a church that she helped to found, and the hunt for St. Oswald's relics is a really interesting event during this time period that might also require its own video, but she was heavily involved in that, and so this is where both she and Ethelred were laid to rest. The 12th century historian Henry of Huntingdon said that Aethelflaed was so powerful that in praise and exaltation of her wonderful gifts, some call her not only lady, but even king. Some state she was J.R.R. Tolkien's inspiration for the shield maiden Éowyn, whose most famous act is to kill the Witch King. He says to her, "Hinder me, thou fool, no living man may hinder me." And Éowyn replies, "But no living man am I. You look upon a woman." And this is the crux of Aethelflaed. She has mostly been forgotten by time, and I think interest in her is resurging, which I'm really, really happy about. Thanks in large part to The Last Kingdom as a television show, I think. But she was in fact caught between 2 of the most memorable men of the Saxon period, her father, Alfred the Great, and her nephew, Aethelstan. Men we can rightly say united England, created the country of England as we know it. But without Aethelflaed, without this woman, would this dream have been achieved? Would Aethelstan have been able to take York, kind of the fabled last kingdom still held by the Danes? Would he have been able to do that without Aethelflaed, without what she achieved in her lifetime? Would Wessex have rightly survived under her brother's reign without her strong leadership to the north in Mercia? I think it is easy to say that none of this would have happened without Alfred, one of history's great players. But I think it's equally easy to say that without Aethelflaed, Alfred's dream would have remained a dream. A woman, a warrior, and as Henry of Huntingdon put it, perhaps a king. If you love Aethelflaed as much as I do, please let me know down below. If she's somebody who is new to you, tell me about that also. I would love to hear what you think of her. Really an incredible woman in history. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.